Okay, so you all probably heard an announcement that says this meeting is being recorded. We want to record it so that those who are unable to attend are able to enjoy being part of it and getting to see what Erin has done and accomplished over these years. So, so we're going to start out with, oops, wait, back up, there we go. Susanna and I prepared a few introductory remarks. So I'm Paige Warren. I am one of Erin's two joint PhD advisors and in the Department of Environmental Conservation here. And I'll start by saying that I first heard from Erin in 2009, December of 2009, when he was thinking about, preparing to graduate from University of Connecticut and looking towards doing a PhD. And he wrote, an excellent introductory email, but at the time I wasn't looking for a PhD student. He contacted me again in 2010 and applied to the program, to the OEB program in 2010. And again, at the time, I just didn't have the funding, and I think I just didn't realize what a gem I was missing out on. So, so luckily for me, a couple years later, he came back and said, by the way, I've done, I'm in my master's degree. I'm doing this kick-butt master's degree in Florida, and I have a fellowship, and now I was interested in thinking about a PhD at UMass. So very typical of Erin. He was very strategic. He said, what do I need to do? I'm going to do this, and then I've got this fellowship, so let me sort of carefully use the fellowship money so I can save some of it for my PhD. And he brought it with him to UMass and came with a plan for an experimental dissertation topic that you'll hear about today. So I was fortunate to have him, come here in part because of those traits that I just talked about, his, ability to come up with a really cool experimental design and carry it out, and the sort of strategic way that he's approached his career. But really the other thing that has made him such, as I use the word gem, is how kind and generous, and what a great citizen of the lab he is, what a great citizen of the program. He's taken leadership positions in lots of different parts of OEB, and been involved in, he's taken a huge role in the Science Cafe, been involved in a lot of public science work. And then, he's just someone who, when he sees something that needs to be done, he just does it. He just and you turn around and go, oh, look, I didn't know you had set that up, but thanks, that was great. So I'm very grateful, and I'm gonna, and aside from just really enjoying getting to know you, Erin, I'm gonna miss you very much. And so I'm gonna pass this over to Susanna before I start crying.
So I just wanted to give a little context of the pictures here. But by the way, I'm Susanna Lerman. I have had the honor of co-advising Erin with Paige over the last couple of years. And when Erin was talking about his research and some of the ideas he had, it just seemed like a perfect opportunity for him to work in a program that I had set up previous years before called Neighborhood Nest Watch. And I've noticed, and I'm very delighted to see a number of Neighborhood Nest Watchers on the call today. So it's really great to have everybody here to see the work that Erin has been doing. But this is a community science project that is looking at backyard bird populations in Western Massachusetts. And here's a picture that I took of Erin on the first day of his PhD research. This is in my backyard. And these are two house wrens that became part of the study that you will soon hear about. And I remember when I took this picture, I told him, I can't wait to use this picture during your defense. And so here we are at Erin's defense. And as Paige mentioned, it's just been an absolute joy to work with Erin. One of the things that's been really exciting for me is my role as his co-advisor is to work with him as being an ambassador to this community science project. And so Erin came into the program with a lot of communication skills. He was a DJ in his former life. But in terms of his ability and his experiences of communicating science with the general public, this I thought was my opportunity to help guide him on his way. And so really trying to figure out ways to explain his science to the public in very digestible manners. And over the years, I've heard from the citizen scientists who have told me how much they've enjoyed working with Erin over the years, how much they've learned from him, and also from the students that Erin has trained over the years. And so that's always, as a co-advisor, when you let your students out into the wild, it's really nice to get that kind of feedback. But I think this also really demonstrates Aaron's commitment to communicating science to everybody and really trying to make science accessible. And as you will hear today and see his, as I know it's going to be an absolutely fabulous presentation, his ability to take these really complicated ideas and really distill them in a way to get people excited about the science that he's done. And so, as Paige mentioned, these types of moments, I think they're very bittersweet. As you know, it's been so much fun to work with Aaron and to watch him grow as a scientist. And we're soon going to get to the stage where we get to fledge Aaron, which is exciting for him and sad for us. But we both, I think I speak for Paige, that we both really look forward to many, many more years of collaborations. So with that, Aaron, we are very excited to hear you tell us all about what you've been doing the last couple of years.
Ooh, thank you. That's a tough introduction to follow. Can you hear me okay, everyone? Good, okay. My computer, in Murphy's Law, my computer's audio cut out. So I'm using my cell phone for audio, but it worked out. Okay. So let me share screen here. All right, and can everyone see my screen? It's good, okay. So before we start, I'm just gonna give a little Zoom 101 since there are people who haven't really used Zoom too much on here, and this is the first Zoom defense I've been to. So the speaker view up in the top right corner will be able to allow you to see the full screen of the presentation. And then I would suggest putting yourself on mute for the entirety of the presentation, just so that we don't hear too much background noise. And at the beginning and the end, you could certainly turn on your video, but during the presentation, you might want to turn the video off, just so that the internet speeds are pretty good. And then, so this is sort of what speaker view looks like, and you'll get a better view of the full screen. And then the chat button is down here, so please hold your questions and comments into the end, and then you could ask them right here in the chat. All right. And hold on a sec, let me see if I could do this. So that should be a little better. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you today about fear, parental behavior, and community structure in residential lands. And here we have an image of Springfield, Mass. And we call this a human-dominated landscape, and it's not hard to see why. And a few things you notice about this landscape is you have the urban core, city center, a commercial district, but you also have a lot of forest, some agriculture, and something else that really stands out to me is how much housing and residential lands there are across this landscape. Some of the residential lands is more densely populated closer to the city center, and then you get more sparsely populated residential lands as you go out into the forested areas. And this is important to consider because human population growth is speeding up. By the year 2050, we're going to see about 9 billion people on this planet. And coupled with the fact that human population is growing and it's also urbanizing. So if you look at this graph of the world population, in 2005, for the first time in human history, we saw that more people lived in urban areas than in rural areas. And this has implications because you would expect as the population's growing and as we see more people move into urban areas, the urban areas will either densify or they'll expand out into formerly intact lands. We're also facing an unprecedented biodiversity crisis. We're seeing vertebrate extinctions way higher than the background extinction rate. and this is cause for conservation concern. And all of these coupled together, it's really important to the conservation of biodiversity to understand how urbanization influences communities and populations. One way that ecologists look at urbanization is across an urban gradient from the rural areas to the more urban core. And what we find is that species richness, which just a count of the number of species, tends to decrease across urban gradients. So you see the rural has a lot of species and then it starts to drop off as you get towards the urban core. But this isn't always the case. We find some surprising things with urban ecology. So in some cases, you see a peak in species richness right in the suburbs, right in between urban and rural. And this might be because you're seeing urban species and rural species meeting in the middle. Not only is species richness altered, but also the interactions between species is altered. And this has population level consequences on those species. So something that humans do really well is input a ton of resources into the system, and also plants. And this could cause trickle-up effects on herbivores and avian predators. So in this example, we have gardens, people putting in fertilizer and water, and that's influencing the arthropods, and that influences the avian predators. So what is missing in all this? And I come from a background of animal behavior. So what I think is missing in the system is animal behavior. Now, there are plenty of urban ecologists that study animal behavior, but in my opinion, it's not integrated enough in our understanding of community interactions and population and community level consequences. So the central thesis of my dissertation is that fear effects of predators, which is a concept from behavioral ecology and evolutionary life history theory, is a critical missing component in our understanding of human-dominated systems. And now I say fear effects, sounds catchy, but what are fear effects? It basically just means that predators are scary and they alter animal behavior. So when I talk about predators for the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about nest predators, things that eat the eggs and nestlings of birds, like, believe it or not, squirrels, chipmunks, raccoons, those sorts of things. And also adult consuming predators like hawks, owls, cats that consume adult birds. And in studies, especially of nest predators, we find huge effects on populations. So this study by Zanette and colleagues introduced predator cues into an environment by playing them out of speakers. It's called a playback experiment. And they played predators of nests, avian nests, and they played control calls. And what they found was that the birds laid fewer eggs, so they had smaller clutches. They fed their nestlings less. And then it also resulted in nestlings that were smaller and lighter, which was a pretty big effect for just introducing sounds into the environment. So to argue my central thesis, I'm going to go through these lines of evidence. First, I'm going to talk about how urbanization alters predator communities. Second, I will talk about how exposure to predator cues and increased urbanization results in reduced nestling condition. And third, I'm going to talk about how predator cues, as well as the habitat features of urbanization, influence investment in offspring. And this is through changes in parental behavior. So first, we're going to talk about urbanization altering predator communities. And this chapter, I'm focusing on mammals. So believe it or not, all three of these species, even the white-tailed deer, eat eggs and nestlings. And so mammals are important nest predators, but they're also important predators of adults. So I especially think of cats as being important adult predators. And thinking about mammal communities and residential lands, I keep going back to this really compelling figure that shows all the land uses in the United States, at least the continental United States, kind of smushed together. And what you see is that if you take residential lands, rural housing and urban housing, as well as urban commercial lands, it makes up an area the size of the northeastern United States. So obviously we shouldn't just be writing off this entire area of the continental United States when it comes to looking at mammal communities. But there have been few studies of mammal communities in residential lands and how they respond to changes across urbanization in residential land specifically. So my question for this is, what is most related to species richness in mammals? And again, species richness means just the number of species. Is it this landscape level urban gradient? If you look at this Springfield area, you see there's a lot of development and not a whole lot of forest. So is it really at this scale that we see a difference in the number of species and what species are present? Or is it more the parcel level features or the property? Is it what we do on our land that determines the species richness changes? So does landscape scale urbanization filter communities? Again, is it really about what types of land uses are around that result in what species we see? Or is it more of this parcel scale habitat management? You could see that backyards could be really different. And this is an interesting thing about residential lands, is that they're very heterogeneous compared to other land use types. And what I mean by that is a yard right next to another yard could be very different, because individual residents act as their own land managers and make decisions about how they're landscaping in their yards. Now, there are some legacy effects and sociological effects that sort of keep it a little more homogeneous, but it's still a lot more heterogeneous than you see for a lot of different land use types. And also, we tend to input a lot of resources and disturbances. And what I mean by that are either intentionally or unintentionally feeding wildlife through birdseed and other things. We do noise and light pollution and mowing lawns. And then there's also the outdoor cats and letting our dogs out in the yards as well. So again, what is most related to species richness? Is this the landscape level urban gradient or more of the parcel level features? And I'm looking at this in a great study system that Susanna mentioned called Neighborhood Nest Watch, which is a Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center and Forest Service initiative. And I get to work right here in the Pioneer Valley in Western Massachusetts. And I'm working with citizen scientist volunteers, some of whom are on this call. And what they do is they monitor the backyard bird nests and the birds in their backyard as well. And they let me do additional studies in their yards, which is great. And these yards are distributed across an urban gradient. And when I took a 1 kilometer, looking at the land use within 1 kilometer of each yard, I was able to develop an urban index, which I'm going to refer to a lot in this talk. And for the urban index, you just have to remember the negative values are more rural, and they correspond to low density residential and forest land. And the higher the values, the more urban. And that's more high density residential and commercial land. And for the mammal study, I did a camera trap sampling study. And that's what this is right here. It's a motion activated camera. And once you deploy it, if something walks by it, it'll snap a photo. And we deployed these from the summer of 2016 to 2018. We had 2 deployments per season, once early and once late in the season. And for each time we deployed them, we had 2 cameras in each backyard. One was set up near this nest box, which I'll talk about later. And the other one was in another spot in the backyard that we thought we'd get mammals passing by. And in the analysis, we treated these as the same sample. They were non-independent. And we deployed them for about 8 days each time. Once we were done with the study, we sampled the habitat to get an idea of this parcel level habitat. So we did 3 11.3 meter radius vegetation habitat plots. And then we also did parcel wide counts of these potential resources and disturbances, which I talked about earlier. And out of these, we looked at which ones were highly correlated, and we condensed it down to ones that, based on the literature, the mammals would likely respond to. And this is what we ended up with. So we had number of vegetable gardens, number of fruit trees, bird feeders, pet food receptacles, The percent log cover also told us a lot about what the composition of the ground cover was like, just more or less logs. How tall the canopy of the trees were, the shrub cover, which gave us an idea of that mid-story, the number of trees in the plot, the mean tree diameter at breast height, which is like how thick a tree is, and then proportion of hardwood versus softwood trees, whether there's more deciduous trees or more coniferous trees in the backyard. And after those 3 years of sampling, we ended up with this suite of species. And I'll give you a second to give myself a little break, and you could just sort of stare at these and try to guess which species these are that we found in the yards. And which ones don't look like the other ones. Yep, so we did get birds, but we also got all these species of mammals, which were really cool. A great level of mammal diversity. And then we also got birds that tended to be ground foragers like blue jays and northern flickers. All in all, we had 150,000 photos. And I'd really like to take this opportunity to thank my undergraduate interns, many of whom spent hours and hours on end going through these thousands of photos and identifying all the species. Without them, it would have probably taken me years to do it on my own. In 36 different backyards, and we got 14 mammal species plus a lot of birds, as I mentioned. And for the purpose of this study, we couldn't determine the difference between the rabbit species. So we ended up grouping the rabbit species as well as the mice species as their own category. So what was the most related to species richness? As you would expect, urbanization was very important. And I'll explain this figure real quick. So we've got urban index on the x-axis from rural up to the most urban, and then the number of species on the y-axis. And you see that this is not linear. It peaks in the suburbs, which is super interesting. So we have the most number of species of mammals in the suburbs, and then it drops off in the more urban and the more rural areas. Mean tree diameter ended up being the only site level variable that was important in the analysis. So we saw that the tree diameters, as they went up, we had an increase in the number of species. Although the extent of influence of these two variables did vary by the species. When I partition the variance out between each species, let's take the raccoon, for example. This blue line here represents the urban index. So urbanization was very important for the raccoon. Versus the mouse here, where it seems that mean tree DVH was pretty important for the mouse. But these two variables together explain most of the variance for all these species. Another thing to note is that just about every yard had cats. I think pretty much every single yard had cats captured on camera. And to give the homeowners credit, the cats were not theirs. They either didn't know or they knew it was their neighbor or something, but time and time again, we found cats in backyards. And this is important to note. Regardless of urbanization, we ended up getting cats because cats kill billions, and that's not exaggeration, billions of small mammals and birds per year, just in the United States. So they are a big conservation concern. My conclusions about the mammals. What was the most related to species richness? Well, urbanization and mean tree diameters were most related to species richness. It seemed like not a lot you could do in your backyard if your backyard is in close to downtown Springfield. You're still going to get the suite of species that you get. But this is just a count of number of species. So it's possible that the things that we do in the backyards, like adding more vegetation, those sorts of things, could have something to do with the abundance of each species. Like we might see more or higher populations of certain species if we manage our yards differently. Or it might have something to do with extinction colonization dynamics, but regardless, urbanization and also retaining mature trees seems to be important. So if you're asking how to manage your yard for wildlife use and connectivity, well, definitely retaining those mature trees and minimizing disturbances. And luckily, there are a lot of resources online and available to you about how to make your backyard wildlife friendly. something else that stood out to me, especially when I was sending the pictures that we found to the landowners, is that the drama of nature really is playing out in your yard. So here's a really interesting shot. This red fox here has a groundhog in its mouth. And this is right near campus in Amherst. So these things are happening right around us. So that's my first line of evidence. Urbanization is altering predator communities. Unfortunately, it was too hard, too difficult in the time and resources we had to get at the avian predators, the hawks and the owls. Turns out you need a huge sample size since they're so low density. But we did get an idea about the cats and about the mammals. So my next line is that exposure to predator cues and increased urbanization results in reduced nestling condition. And there have been a lot of studies about bird nesting across these urban gradients. And an interesting finding is that they keep finding again and again that there are smaller and lighter nestlings in more urban areas. Right before they leave the nest, they're smaller and lighter, and that has huge implications on their survival. But we're not quite sure why these nestling conditions are reduced. We have some great ideas, but not a lot of experimental evidence to point at how important certain things are. And I'm going to introduce this figure here. So we have these urbanization effects, let's say habitat structure, food, nest predators, and adult consuming predators. They're all influencing the birds. And the birds are doing this parental provisioning, which is just feeding their nestlings. And that results in differences in nestling condition, and that affects the nestling's probability of survival. And again, my central thesis is that fear effects of predators are a critical missing component in our understanding of human-dominated systems. And that fear effects are basically that predators are scary and they alter animal behavior. So I think that fear is a really important and underlooked part of this urban system. And that it could be partially or in big part explaining these reductions in nestling mass. And this is also because of something in urban ecology we call the predation paradox, which is basically that in urban areas, we see huge densities, high densities of potential predators like chipmunks, squirrels, even hawks, but we get low rates of per capita predation. And what this means is that the birds are out there seeing all sorts of predators and getting their cues and probably being fearful of them, but they on average have a lower chance of getting eaten and their nestlings have a lower chance of getting eaten. So could the fear effects be representing a mismatch between the cues, what they're perceiving, and then the actual predation risk? And is this resulting in reduced nestling mass? And then what about these adult consuming predators? We do know from previous studies in more intact systems that the adult consuming predators do have an effect on animal behavior. So instead of thinking about it like this, we could think about it more in terms of like a seesaw or teeter-totter, with the bird being able to have behavioral plasticity in their investment, which basically means that they're making decisions unconsciously or not about whether they're going to invest more in the parenting end or the self-maintenance and vigilance end, like keeping themselves alive. And when we have all these things inputted, it's really fine-tuned over evolutionary time to maximize something called their lifetime reproductive fitness. And if you think about it, if you take the nestling's probability of survival in a given season, so they're investing a lot in that, and then if you take the number of breeding seasons that a bird has and multiply those together, you get the lifetime reproductive fitness. And what we did in this system is that we added fear effects in experimentally through playing predator cues into the system. So there's probably fear effects that are already present along with all these other urbanization effects. And by doing an experiment where we added the fear effects into the system, we could see if it influences the nestling condition. So my experimental hypothesis for this is that urbanization will influence nestling condition. And the other one is that fear effects of adult consuming predators will also influence nestling condition. And as mentioned before, I worked with this amazing study species, the house wren. They're widely distributed. They're a great study species because they're all over the place. They nest in backyards across an urban gradient. And if you build a nest box for them or a birdhouse, they'll come and they'll nest in that nest box. They might even kick a bluebird out of there, which I bet a lot of the nest watchers were pretty annoyed with, but it helped my study at least. What I did was I built these nest boxes and then I distributed them across the backyards in this neighborhood nest watch system that we talked about. And again, to remind you, it's an urban gradient from more rural negative values to more urban positive values. And then I experimentally scared the nestlings and the birds. So what I did was I set out these portable playback units, which contained a speaker, an MP3 player, batteries. And once the birds nested and laid their eggs, I randomly selected whether the nest would get the predator treatment or the control treatment. Control treatment was just harmless birds like mourning doves and downy woodpeckers. No one's really scared of those. And the predator treatment were Cooper's hawks and eastern screech owls. Presumably, this would change the adult's behavior, and then we'd see a difference in the nestling condition. And we deployed these, we didn't like hammer them with these predator calls. We really tried to make it realistic in the volume and the rates of them. And then we also took them in and out of the yards at regular intervals so they wouldn't get habituated to it, to the playbacks. Then the part my interns in the field liked the most, and me too, measuring the nestling growth over time. So we measured their mass and their size as they grew up. Obviously eggs, here's one that was probably just like 3, 4, 5 days old, and then ones that are just about to leave the nest. So you have to be really careful opening that nest box. And we ended up taking nestling mass at 12 days old for our analysis, because when we looked at growth, we saw that this was their peak mass, and it was right before they're about to fledge or leave the nest. And that's a critical time, because what condition they're in at that point really helps determine their survival. So what did we find for urbanization? Well, we found that nestling mass decreased with increased urbanization. So again, on the x-axis, we've got rural to urban. On the y-axis, we have the nestling's mass in grams at 12 days old. And we saw a 10% reduction in nestling body mass across the urbanization gradient, which is very significant to nestlings that small. And then we also looked at the fear effects. And with the playback, we found that nestling mass decreased with the introduction of predator cues. So the orange bar is the predators, the blue is the control. And again, we saw about a 10% reduction in nestling body mass when we introduced predator cues. And these didn't interact. So regardless of the predator cues across urbanization, we saw the decrease. And regardless of urbanization, when we introduced the playback, we also saw this decrease. So fear was having an effect on nestling condition. And this really points to the potential that fear effects could be a mechanism that are influencing the nestling mass. For size, we didn't really get a significant effect, which is interesting, and we could certainly talk about it, but for their mass, that it was significantly reduced. So what we believe fear effects were doing is that they're pushing that investment more toward the self-maintenance and vigilance, because if you think that you're about to be eaten by a predator, it's better to maintain yourself and remain vigilant so that you could survive future breeding seasons. So for that section, we found that exposure to predator cues and increased urbanization resulted in reduced nestling condition. Now, we would like to link that reduction in nestling condition to actual changes in parental behavior. So the fact that these predator cues and the habitat features influence investment in offspring via changes in parental behavior. And what this chapter really got at were, what were the proximate effects of urbanization and fear? In other words, what's the direct cause of this reduction in mass? And we know from previous studies, even with house wrens, that fear reduces parental investment. Again, pushing the bird, in theory, more toward the self-maintenance and vigilance. But we also know that urbanization, the habitat structure, influences the food resources. Narango and colleagues found that if you have more native wildflowers in your backyard and native plants in general, you increase the quality of the arthropod food resources that chickadees feed their nestlings, and the nestlings end up in better condition. Another feature of urbanization is microclimate and the urban heat island effect. We know that that pavement and other impervious surface causes downtown and commercial districts to heat up more than the suburban and rural areas. So microclimate could certainly have an influence on the phenology of the arthropods and the flowering plants. And it can also have a direct effect on the growth of the nestlings. So you can see this is day 0. This is when they're just hatching. And they're tiny, and for house wrens, they aren't feathered. So it's hard for them to thermoregulate. And the adult house wrens, especially the female in this case, does something called brooding, where she basically incubates the nestling. She like sits on top of them and transfers her heat to them. So if a place is hotter, you could expect that the nestlings would have maybe an easier time thermoregulating, and their growth rate might even be different. My hypothesis for this section is that the fear effects of predators will influence parental investment, and that habitat and microclimate, which are components of urbanization, are related to parental investment. And here, when I talk about parental investment, I talk about provisioning and brooding. So provisioning, again, is feeding nestlings, and brooding is sitting on them and thermoregulating them. And this was during the same experiment with the nest boxes in the study system, where we introduced those playbacks. In addition to doing that study, we put iButton temperature loggers out, which are these little buttons that take a temperature. And we had one external to the nest, and it took a temperature every hour from May until August. And then we also put one in each nest once they laid their eggs, which took on a temperature internally every 24 minutes from egg laying to fledge, or when they leave the nest. And again, we did that habitat sampling. And for this study, we ended up including the mean tree diameters, the number of flower gardens, number of veggie gardens, the percent hardwood versus softwood trees, and the shrub cover. For this study, we did it from 2016 to 2018, and we set out these GoPro cameras right at the nest. One during the early stage of nesting from 0 to 9 days old, and then one late stage from 9 days old to fledge day. We took videos from 8 to 10 a.m., randomized which order of the nests we took the videos of, and then we brought the videos back into the lab. And again, a huge thank you to the interns who watched these videos, at least 2 people per video, and scored the behaviors with a program called JWatcher. And they basically, the main thing they looked at were how many times and what duration the birds entered and exited the nest box. So what did we find? And for this section, I'm just going to focus on the provisioning, because that is really very important to the nestling growth, and also brooding was pretty complicated, and we still have to sort of work out what was going on there. And it was so interesting to watch the nestlings grow over time. And don't worry too much about that green marker on the nestling's leg. That's how we individually identified them. And they really grew fast, and they got more feathered. And at this point, it's hard to hold on to them without them escaping, which is really fun. And I'm going to walk through this provisioning visits figure pretty slowly because it's a little bit complicated. But basically what we found is that the provisioning visits, or the number of times that the birds visited per minute, differed by age, playback, and urbanization. So a 3-way interaction. And on the x-axis, as usual, we have urbanization from rural to urban. And this is at 3 days old. And we have the playbacks here. The blue is the control and the orange is the predator. And then on the y-axis, we just have how many provisioning visits per minute. And as we look at as they get older, so that was a little quick, I'll show you again. If you want to just focus on the blue line, so the control, when we introduced the control playbacks, as they got older, the effect changed. So at 9 and especially 12 days old, we saw that urbanization really was related to provisioning visits. The more rural sites, the more often they provisioned than the urban. But if you look at the orange line, the predators, it looks like the predators were suppressed, or sorry, the predator cues suppressed provisioning rates across the gradient, regardless of age. So again, the orange line is showing that the provisioning visits were suppressed across urbanization with predator cues. Whereas it seems like when we didn't introduce the predators, there was a strong effect on urbanization as they aged. But when they're younger, there wasn't as strong of an effect, or any effect at all, really, which is a very interesting finding. So we found that fear effects did influence parental investment. What about the habitat and microclimate? Well, out of the habitat metrics that we used, there were no evidence of habitat variables being related to the provisioning visits. There is interestingly no evidence of an urban heat island effect with the external eye button temperatures. But we could take this with a grain of salt because it was really only a sample size of 36 backyards. And it's possible we just didn't capture it. What we did find is that there was a larger mean tree DBH. So with larger trees, or sorry, wider trees, we found a lower mean temperature and also a lower standard deviation or variance in external temperatures. What this means is if the backyard had larger trees, the temperatures on average were lower, and also the variability between the temperatures were lower for the external temperature. So still the jury's out on habitat and microclimate. There have been plenty of other studies that have shown that they're related to parental investment and nestling condition, but we didn't find evidence in our system. And that might be just because of the nature of the experiment, where we introduced a predator call that just suppressed the parental investment for like half of the nests. So now our conclusions. Again, to remind you, we explored the central thesis that the fear effects of predators is a critical missing component in our understanding of human-dominated systems. We found that mammal species richness peaks in the suburbs and increases with larger trees. And that nestling mass decreased with predator cues, and it also decreased with the urban gradient. And this was linked to the behavior. So the provisioning visits differed by the age, the playback, and urbanization. So with these boxes checked off, we can say that this series of studies provide some compelling evidence that fear is a potential mechanism of reduced nestling condition and even population level effects potentially across urban gradients, especially with this predation paradox of there being high densities of predators in more urban areas, and this mismatch between the fear and the perception of risk and then the actual risk. And this is really important. Taking it back to this Springfield study system, it's really important as the world urbanizes that we protect and think about how we can predict how wildlife will respond to this urbanization, including wildlife in backyards and in residential areas. Conserving backyard birds is important not only for the species themselves, but the fact that they are really our most salient connection to nature, especially with all of us being cooped up in our houses. Many of us have taken great joy in watching our backyard birds and thinking about how important they are to us. And wow, there's so many people I have to thank here, including my funders and support. But I'll start definitely with Paige and Susanna, who have been amazing co-advisors. They have led me through this. They have been in my ring this entire time and have helped me, complete this work. I would love to thank my committee, Bethany and Alex. They have been a very supportive committee. They've also given me some great advice about writing and journals and analysis and all sorts of stuff, as well as Katie Sieving, who is my master's advisor, who helped me with the study design here. And a definite huge thanks to the Warren and Lerman labs. Here, I'll stop share. The Warren and Lerman labs, Des, Evan, Kit, Kyle, Melanie, Sebastian, really amazing lab group to work with and always had my back. And we've been a really tight-knit lab who have always been really kind to each other and supportive. I would also like to thank the undergraduate interns. There are a lot of them. Some of them did their own independent research and they were just amazing to work with. I love hearing from them. I love seeing where their passions have taken them. I couldn't have done this without you all. My small but mighty cohort, Abby, Leon, Briamar, we really helped each other through these times in the OEB transition as well. And it's been amazing to be part of your cohort. The OEB and eco communities, as well as the science cafe and that's life science communities. There's such a community spirit at this university and in these programs. And it's a great support system for PhD students. The neighborhood Nest Watch participants, oh man. They provided me so much access to their backyards and they were so engaged and interested the whole time. And it was amazing to work with you all. Of course, my friends and family, I absolutely could not have done this without you and your support and your good cheer and your humor through all this. Thank you to my late grandmother, grandfather, grandma and pop, who encouraged me throughout my education, are surely proud of this moment. My mom, my dad, Brian and Kat, you've always been in my corner. Tom and Jack especially, you've been cheering me on this entire time. And finally, Claire, my spouse, who has been on my side and is my best friend and has helped me through the toughest times and celebrated the best times with me. So with that, I would like to take any questions and thank you for coming.
Let's have a round of applause. People can use the little applause thingy and the reaction button if you want. Yay, turn on your unmute if you want to clap loudly, that's fine for a little celebratory.
Ooh, go Aaron!
Okay, I'll mute everybody again. And then Aaron, do you want to field the questions in the chat box?
Yeah, sure. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sure, that's.
Are you, say something again, Aaron, so we can hear.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you, good.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I've been doing audio with my cell phone and video with the computer, so it's defenses. Anyway, thank you all, and let's see if any questions pop up. This is always the awkward part of Zoom. It takes a little while. Okay, let's see here. So I have a question from Steve McCormick. Said, fantastic presentation. Thanks for sharing this interesting work. I'm curious about increased noise associated with urbanization as a factor affecting the predators and the birds. Were you able to measure noise in your nest surveys? If not, do you think noise has an effect on predators or the ability of birds to perceive predators? That's a great question, especially since I'll stop sharing that. sorry, maybe I'll just do that. Especially since I think about noise a lot, since that was my master's thesis and all that. And we did measure noise, but it was very highly correlated to all the other metrics of urbanization. So it was hard to like parse that apart. But we do know from many studies that noise in urban environments and also in forest environments does influence the community composition, and it influences the relationship sometimes between predators and prey, since it's harder for them to detect their predators and their prey during noise. So we didn't really get at that with this study, but it is something. I have the decibel levels of the backyards, and it's something that we should explore if we could parse those things apart. All right, let's see if we have another question. This is from Janice, who's a neighborhood nest watcher. And does monitoring the nests by the citizen scientists introduce a fear factor at problematic levels? And that is an important question to ask. We ask this question all the time as scientists, and that's why we have to go through a really rigorous process for our studies to be approved, including trying to minimize how much disturbance we have and minimize our sample size. In the end, I couldn't tell you that it doesn't introduce some kind of fear, but especially for the species that we're studying, they go right back to the nest and start feeding again. Like we saw that with our videos, we would set up the video, the parents would fledge and they would flush and leave the nest, and then within a minute they'd be back to feeding them again. So it might have a little bit more stress involved, but it's really the trade-off between doing these studies to understand how to conserve these species, and that's why we don't, we don't regularly mess around with bird nests unless you're monitoring them. All right, and actually Nancy, who's another nest watcher, asked that question as well, which is, I guess, a concern to the nest watchers. So maybe that could be a future study. Someone has one of my eye buttons that they found. The birds would often pick them out of their nests and fly away with them, and they're expensive, so it kind of stank, but we tried to wire them in as best as possible. So thank you for letting me know that. Corey Elo asks, awesome job. I was wondering how you thought the fear effects of the predators you recorded might be different, since many of the mammals are tougher to detect than the bird recordings you used. Let me think. How the fear effects of the predators. So the hawks and the owls. Yeah, so I think I use them because they really do seem like they're predators of adults, although they could potentially also be predators of fledglings. I made the decision to do adult consuming predators because we know so little about them. In retrospect, it would have also been really interesting to play mammal predators, chipmunks and raccoons and those sorts of sounds. I'm not sure if I answered that question. You could unmute if you want to clarify, but I think I might have answered. Okay.
Yeah, that was good. Thanks.
Thanks, Corey. All right, another question from Jeff Podos. Excellent presentation, Aaron. Did you notice if there are any difference in the quality of the food items that parents brought in the fear condition? I know I'm not good at shopping when Marty, the stop and shop robot, is roaming the aisles and staring at me. Yeah, I agree with that. And that is something to think about. It's not just the quantity of food, but the quality of food that they're bringing in. And there are ways to get at it. It's tough with a nest box and with birds this small, but people have looked at house wrens and, for instance, scored how juicy the bug is that's in the wren's mouth. But to really get at it, you would have to sample the arthropod community in the backyards and then do some sort of maybe stable isotope analysis or other type of analysis to figure out what the wren nestlings are ingesting, which would be an awesome study idea. And people in our lab have dove down that entomological rabbit hole, and I chose not to just because of the time constraints and everything I was looking at. All right, let's see, are there any more questions?
Hey, Aaron, I think Tony Lynn had her hand raised, but I don't think she's
okay.
Online.
Well, she could unmute if she wants to ask a question. I think she's driving, so she's unable to type it out.
Yeah, thank you. Exactly. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Great job. That was excellent. I remember the experience with the nest box you put in my backyard where there were eggs for a little while and then they were gone. And we talked about interest-specific competition with the house wrens and how the males will kick each other out of nests. Is there any research or have you looked into it all if that is affected by urbanization or, the fear landscape?
That's a great question. And in our study, we didn't really get at that. I can imagine that we could explore, since there's so much data over the years about how big potentially these wren territories are and how many wrens are in a backyard, we could explore that. And wrens eating other wrens' eggs, or not eating them, but destroying them, is a huge problem. Wrens are kind of vicious. They're an interesting study species. They are very competitive when it comes to these nest boxes. So oftentimes they'll go into another wren's nest and poke holes in all the eggs and throw them out. And there's even been studies of fear predators where they just introduce other wren calls into the area and the wrens change their behavior. So that is definitely something that we could think about. For this study, we didn't explore it too much, although we did note when the eggs were poked, or when we saw they kept disappearing one after the other, it was likely another wren doing that. And we also had a lot of issues with house sparrows too, which is another nest box nesting bird. So great question.
Thanks.
You're welcome. All right, a couple more questions. So this is from Andrew Rice. Do nestling predators have the same predators for the adult birds? Would the sound of a hawk scare a squirrel away? And the answer is yes. And that was something I really had to take into account. In my Katie Sieving's lab, Fang Wan did this amazing study where she introduced hawk and owl calls in a forest, and it changed the whole community composition of the forest. So that was a definite caveat that we have to think about. And to try to mitigate that, that's why I made these portable playback units, and I only set them up and played the predator calls when the nests had eggs in them. And I played them as quiet as possible, as to be realistic. I only set them up about 5 meters from the nest. And that was all trying to avoid scaring away the actual predators. But that is something definitely to think about, is that the effects we could see are almost certainly a combination of the fear effects of the adult consuming predators and the fear effects of the nest predators. All right, maybe I'll take one more question, if that's okay. So Kit Straley asked, what is the most surprising observation for you, either in the yards while you're in the field or in the lab looking at camera traps or nest footage? That's a great question. I think the cats actually was one of the most surprising things. I just couldn't believe how many cats were in these yards. And it was very frustrating to show. It was almost like a security camera for the nest watchers. They would see this cat in their yard, they're like, oh, that's my neighbor. I've been telling them to put their cat in the house and they don't listen to me. And it's really such a contentious thing, but cats are a real issue. And then the other one is, I entered a backyard once and I saw 2 male house wrens literally wrestling on the ground in the dirt, just like spinning around and wrestling. And this was sort of a soap opera-like conflict between 2 male wrens and then another outside male wren. And then there were females and there were 2 different nests and they kept destroying each other's nests. And as interesting as it was to watch that all play out as a person who studies animal behavior, I could not get a sample that year in that backyard because they just kept wrecking each other, kind of Game of Thrones style almost, just like, you know, counterattacking and things. So that's a good question. All right, should we do a couple more, or let's see. I guess I'll do the one last question. This is from Nancy Baker, nest watcher. I found after several nest failures that house sparrows have taken over the nest box. House sparrows seem to keep a lot of species out, and I'm wondering what can be done about them. They're really aggressive, and the one thing that we could really do about house sparrows is the size of the nest hole the cavity. House sparrows can't get into a nest cavity, I believe, smaller than 1.5 inches. So I made my nest boxes 1 inch because that almost only lets house wrens in. But of course, like over the winter, chipmunks chew on it and it gets wider. You could put something metal there to keep that from happening. And then I think it's 1.25 inches allows chickadees in there, but not the house sparrows. And you can check out Project Feeder Watch has a great resource, I believe, on how to build nest boxes to keep house sparrows out. But they're vicious and they'll still, even if they can't get into the nest box, they'll still attack. So it was kind of concerning. All right.
All right, so we thank Aaron once more, and everybody who wants to, please put on your videos. Let's we'll do an maybe you'll stop the sharing, Aaron, so we can see everybody's, put yourself in gallery view, and feel free to put on a video and say hello before you duck out.
Great,
Yay.
great job, Aaron.
Thank you.
Well done.
Awesome job.
Yep.
So great to see you all. Stay safe and stay happy.
You too.
Fantastic job, Aaron. Really
Thank
great.
you.
Don't let your committee give you too much of a hard time.
Okay, yeah.
They seem like a pretty mean group to